Hello to all my dear followers. I'd like to welcome you to a new chapter of What if Naruto trains to become a Genjutsu master alongside Kurenai? At the top right of the screen, I've left a card with a playlist showing all the chapters of this fanfic in order. Please, I ask for your likes and comments so I can bring you more chapters. Without further ado, enjoy.
2 days after the invasion, the damages had been assessed all over the village, and the defenses of Konoha had been weakened. However, because of Naruto's stalling tactics, as pitiful as they seemed, they had prevented a large amount of collateral damage from being inflicted. As such, the real damage done to the village was where the three-headed snake and Gamahiro had made their short fight. Luckily, that was in the abandoned Uchiha district, which was not much of a concern as no one lived there. Naruto's contribution to the invasion did not go unacknowledged. The majority of the civilians did not believe the claims of Naruto's clones helping people out. Alternatively, the younger generation looked at Naruto with a new light, seeing something other than the horrible prankster he had been made out to be. He still received glares, but now some of the younger generation stared at him in confusion and, in some cases, awe. It wasn't much of a change, but it was something. The only thing on people's minds was whom would be promoted to Chunin. The main reason for the exams had been shown and the judges had seen almost every fight. However, nothing had been announced. The Reconnecting was still within the village with his small entourage, but all of Tsunade's shinobi had fled back to their villages, with the injured having been returned by the Hokage once the information that Orochimaru had impersonated the Kazekage had been released. So, it was with this mindset that had Naruto excited to be within the Hokage office after the invasion, believing he had managed to be promoted. Not that it made much difference now that Jiraiya's apprenticeship had been announced a bit more publicly to the Ninja Corp. Jiraiya had told him the day after the invasion of the announcement he had made, and Naruto had surprised the man with a strong hug, in honor of their newly minted official relation, much like the one he had given Kurenai. Naruto stood proudly as he looked at the Hokage, Jiraiya, Kurenai, the Reconnecting, and his 2 bodyguards, plus Yujito, whom was standing near the well-endowed Busta Blonde. "Thank you for coming, Naruto-kun," the Hokage said. Naruto nodded. "Now, I know you're probably thinking this is about the Chunin promotions, but I'm sorry to inform you that this has nothing to do with that." Naruto blinked in confusion. "The reason I have called you here today is that you have been requested for a mission," he said seriously, causing Naruto to tense slightly. It was almost unheard of for a genin to be requested for a specific mission. "What mission, Hokage-jiji?" Naruto asked, showing a bit of respect since there was a visiting Kage in the room, plus that guy who looked like the Reconnecting had to be some sort of Jinchuriki going by the feeling of his chakra. Sarutobi chuckled, as did the Reconnecting. "This brat seems to know you well, Hokage Dano. I think I chose an interesting one for my escort," the Reconnecting said in his deep voice. Naruto turned his eyes onto the Reconnecting, and they narrowed in suspicion as the Reconnecting then stopped chuckling and stared Naruto down. The group in the room felt the tension rise as the 2 shinobi stared at each other. No killing or malicious intent was felt, merely a wave of questions flying between the 2, flowing and ebbing quickly until Naruto nodded curtly at the Reconnecting. "I accept, Reconnecting Dano. Whom else shall accompany us upon your departure?" Naruto asked, once again thanking Shika for his mini dictionary he had written for him. The Reconnecting smirked. "I only wanted you, but," he said, sending a glance at Kurenai and Jiraiya. "Kurenai and Jiraiya will accompany you along with 2 others to the border," the Hokage interjected, causing Naruto to turn to him and the Hokage to turn to the Reconnecting. "Now would you please excuse us, Reconnecting Dano? I have business with Naruto-kun," he said while standing and gesturing for him to leave the office. The Reconnecting, seemingly, took no offense at being dismissed while he and his bodyguards left the office with Yujito. Naruto looked at the Hokage as he activated some seals around the room as soon as the Reconnecting had left. Naruto's eyebrow rose as he watched the seals activate. The Hokage then fixed Naruto with a determined stare as Jiraiya folded his arms. Kurenai seemed to be the only one whom hadn't moved. Naruto gulped slightly. "Ha ha ha, you're about to get grilled about our packed brat. This should be fun to watch." The Kyuubi taunted from its cage. Naruto rolled his eyes at it mentally. "Shut up, you stupid fox. I'm trying to figure out what exactly I should tell them," Naruto retorted. "Don't insult me, you imbecile. I am still the Kyuubi no Yoko and can deny you access to my Yuki? Or did your pitiful mind forget that small fact, The Kyuubi roared in defiance. Naruto flinched slightly from the volume of its roar. "Kyuubi annoying you, Naruto-kun?" the Hokage asked calmly. Naruto nodded slightly as he tried to block out Kyuubi's roars before he froze and turned his full attention on the concerned glares that were now being given to him by the other 3 people in the room. Naruto cursed in his head and the Kyuubi laughed its malicious laugh. "Good job, brat," it said as it fell quiet. Naruto sent feelings of reproach towards the great beast before he ignored its chuckles. "So, how long have you been in contact with the Kyuubi and what exactly is its relation with you?" the Hokage asked. Though his voice was calm, there was the same tone he had used to reprimand Naruto when he was younger. Naruto flinched slightly. He hated that tone. It was the tone of disapproval, a tone of voice he was all too familiar with. Naruto took a shuddering breath before looking at his teachers and the Hokage. "I first came into contact with Kyuubi when my team encountered Orochimaru in the Forest of Death," he says, causing them to nod. "Now, I didn't explain the fight, but basically the snake bastard kicked our asses around until he placed the curse mark on Sasuke," Naruto said, which caused nods all around again. "Once he did, I tapped into Kyuubi's Yuki again and managed to hit him and disorient him long enough to switch with a clone while placing a small Genjutsu on myself to keep me hidden," he said, which caused looks of appreciation to come to light and one of pride in Kurenai's. "Anyways, my clone held off Orochimaru for a bit longer, but it was obviously a futile effort. He managed to ensnare my clone, then placed some odd seal over the seal on my clone's stomach, the backlash of which caused me to fall unconscious," Naruto said. Jiraiya stepped forward. "Was this the seal?" he asked as his fingers glowed with kanji. Naruto nodded and the Hokage motioned him to continue as Jiraiya stepped back. Naruto then explained how his mindscape looked and how he had moved through the darkness and the short speech he had with the Kyuubi. When Naruto mentioned a pact, the 3 shinobi grimaced and looked at Naruto in worry. Naruto continued before they could continue, recalling the event. Scene break, flashback, let's talk terms, Naruto said. Kyuubi blinked before a Cheshire grin appeared on its lips. "What is it your pathetic mind can think of that will allow me what I want?" it said. Naruto frowned slightly. "Well, I think we should establish what we each want," he said after a slight pause. "So, what do you want?" he asked. "Freedom from this seal," Kyuubi roared. Naruto rolled his eyes. "And you say we ninjen are the dumb ones. Do you really think I'm dumb enough to let you out of the seal knowing full well anything I get from it would kill me?" Naruto asked, and Kyuubi shook its massive head. "I know little about this seal, but the one thing I do know is that this seal is tied to both of our lives. The only way for me to have complete freedom would be for me to force my way past the seal when you are at death's door, you stupid brat," the Kyuubi reprimanded to Naruto's wide eyes. "I want freedom of this cage, senses, a body, any way you can think of to bypass the seal and allow me access to the outside world, and that will be one point that I am willing to make a pact over," the Kyuubi said. Naruto thought about it for a few minutes before saying, "And I want your Yuki to stop affecting my bloodline so I don't die when I'm 50. Also, access to your Yuki when I need it," Naruto demands. Kyuubi smirks. "If you can find a way to grant my freedom in some way, then I will grant both of those requests," it says. "Furthermore, there will be a mental connection between the 2 of us after this pact is formed, so you will be capable of communicating me without having to return here," Kyuubi informs him. Naruto nods before thinking for a few seconds and finally says, "Can you tell me about your powers?" he asks. Kyuubi looks at Naruto before smirking as if it had just gained a delicious meal. Naruto shivers as he looks at Kyuubi's grin. End flashback. Scene break. Naruto is looking at the surprised looks of Jiraiya and the Hokage. Kurenai was regarding him with a critical eye and Naruto waited until they had taken in all of his information. Turns out that each of the Biju's Yuki grants complete control over one thing when controlled correctly by the Biju or with the Jinchuriki cooperating with their Biju, like the sand from Gaara's Shikaku. Naruto says, causing the other 3 to raise their eyebrows. Kyuubi's Yuki allows for it to alter reality to how it sees fit. It holds true that the fox is a user of Genjutsu, only it makes its illusions real in order to increase its killer capabilities. He explains, "So, that's how you made your Genjutsu real during the invasion and how you managed to put Shikaku to sleep instead of Gaara-san?" the Hokage asked, having been briefed about Naruto's fight from people who watched him incapacitate Gaara while fighting in the stands. Naruto nodded. The ability to make Genjutsu real. Something Genjutsu masters have been attempting to do for generations, and Naruto figures it out after only having been under my tutelage for some months. Kurenai says to herself as she chuckles at the irony of it. Naruto smiles slightly. It's not quite so simple. There are genjutsu that I cannot make real because of their conditions, and even the ones I can make real are limited to how much Yuki I can control into the constructs that need to be made. Naruto says, repeating Kyuubi's words as he had told him when explaining his power. So, you are limited in how many or how complicated an object you make because it uses more concentration and Yuki to make more complex items than something simpler. Jiraiya said, causing Naruto to nod once more. Can the Kyuubi influence you at all besides speaking to you? Which, I feel I must tell you, is something I am not comfortable with? The Hokage asked. Naruto didn't hesitate to shake his head in the negative. Very well, Naruto-kun. Raise your shirt so Jiraiya can inspect the seal. The Hokage ordered. Naruto grimaced at the order, slightly sad he had forced him to order him instead of asking him like last time, but Naruto complied and Jiraiya only took one look at the seal before standing back up and nodding. The Hokage let loose a sigh of relief before fixing Naruto with yet another stare. I don't like you keeping secrets, Naruto-kun, especially one so important as you communicating with the Kyuubi. The Sandaime reprimanded. Naruto grimaced and words slipped out before he could stop them. Just as I don't like being lied to, Hokage-sama, but it happens. He responded and his teachers sent a worried look at the Hokage. The Hokage had looked down. No one could see the man's eyes. Indeed it does, Naruto-kun. The Hokage said sadly, still not looking up at Naruto. Conscious of the stares being lain upon him, he looked back up, sadness reflecting in his eyes, but he soldiered on as the Kage he was. Now, I had hoped to leave all genin out of missions for a week to allow them to let the invasion pass, but it seems my hand has been forced in your case, Naruto-kun. The old man said tiredly as he looked down again. The Fire Lord was impressed with your fight, especially with your abilities shown during the invasion, and made a direct request that you attend to a specific mission. He informed the slightly shocked Naruto. Kurenai and Jiraiya were frowning. I had asked him to reconsider setting you such a mission so soon, but he feels it would be a great experience. The Hokage ground out, not seeming to like the mission much himself. Naruto narrowed his eyes. What's the mission, Hokage-jiji? He asked. The Sandaime sighed heavily before looking up. Genin Uzumaki Naruto, you are hereby ordered to take along a team of 3 persons plus yourself to the border of Fire Country and Sound Country. Upon arrival, you and your team are to locate and destroy the bandit group known as the Crimson Hand, which has been plaguing the countryside around there for much too long. You are required to bring the head of the bandits' leader as proof of success. The Hokage said with steel in his voice. Naruto's eyes widened once again as he looked at the A-rank mission folder he had just been handed. Approximate troops for the bandits and a picture of the leader has been included in the mission dossier. This mission commences as soon as you safely escort the Raikage to the border of Fire Country. He finished. Naruto looked slowly to his 2 teachers. Jiraiya looked worried, but Kurenai was looking grimly at him. He looked back down at the mission folder and then back to the Hokage, who was frowning. A tense silence filled the room as Naruto's head swiveled around a few more times before. Why is it A-ranked? He finally asked. The Hokage grimaced and Jiraiya spoke. Look at the amount of bandits within the group, Naruto, he said, a serious tone denoting his demeanor. Naruto slowly opened the mission dossier and nearly fainted as he looked at the number of approximate troops. 1,500 bandits. Naruto stuttered slightly as he gripped the desk he was near to steady himself. Naruto's eyes darted over the mission dossier. There was an upside. The bandits almost definitely didn't have any ninja, but still, with only 4 people, that was over 300 bandits a person that would have to be killed. This type of mission was more suited for a team of jounin. He may have waylaid 300 bandits before, but he had passed out shortly thereafter from the strain of such an attempt. But he knew he didn't have any choice as to taking this mission. Otherwise the Sandaime wouldn't have even handed it to him. Naruto took a deep breath. Who can I bring? He asked. The Sandaime smirked lightly. I already chose your group. People I think that will help you the most during your fight. They will meet you at the village gates. I hope you don't mind, the Hokage said. Naruto shook his head. Of course the Hokage would have a better idea of who would help him the most. That is all I needed to see you about, Naruto-kun. Good luck, he said as the seals surrounding the room faded and Jiraiya and Kurenai stepped up next to Naruto and Naruto turned as they proceeded out of the room to meet the Raikage entourage at the gate, along with Naruto's team. Scene break. The three made their way down the main street. Naruto was considerably happy to have his two teachers with him. Why didn't you tell us about the QB Naruto-kun? Kurenai asked softly as the three walked down the almost deserted road, since it was so early in the morning. Naruto glanced at her and Jiraiya, both of them looking at him expectantly, and he sighed softly. Honestly, I was going to tell you after the exams. I meant to never use its power, he said quietly. I hadn't wanted to tell you because… He trailed off, thinking back and trying to figure out why exactly he hadn't wanted to tell them when he had told them everything else, but nothing came to mind. He looked away from them. I don't know why I didn't tell you. I just felt I shouldn't for some reason, he said honestly after not being able to come up with something. Kurenai frowned and Jiraiya looked up and away from him. Okay, Naruto. Please don't withhold any more secrets. Despite your previous teachers, we have done nothing to not gain your trust. Jiraiya scolded lightly as he motioned to Kurenai and himself. Naruto looked back up at him. I trust you to hold my jutsu in secret, and so I expect to hold your secrets. That is the bond between teacher and student, Jiraiya said as he favored him with a small smile. Right? He asks lightly. Naruto ponders that for a few moments and can see Kurenai looking at him with an odd look in her eyes. I'm sorry, he says after having remained silent for a few more minutes. It's okay, Naruto. I know I don't have the same relationship you have with Kurenai, but I expect you to be able to confide in me eventually, Jiraiya says as he looks back at Naruto. At least, I hope that trust will emerge on your part. I already trust you, Naruto, he says with a smile as he then smirks. I'll let you two talk. Meet you at the gate, he says as he disappears into a swirl of leaves. Naruto looks back down at the ground, not able to meet Kurenai's gaze. He can feel her eyes on him even as they walk, but he cannot figure out why he didn't tell her, and it hurts him to be holding secrets from her. Not only because she was his sensei, but because she was also his girlfriend. She stops next to him, allowing him to take a few steps away from her before he turned and faced her. Noticing she had stopped, but he still doesn't meet her gaze. What's wrong, Kurenai-chan? He asks. Kurenai steps closer to him and bends down onto one knee to reach his height. Still, Naruto turns his head so he doesn't look at her. I know we haven't been able to see each other since the invasion, but why won't you look at me, Naruto-kun? She asks lightly, though a tone of hurt could be heard hidden within her melodious voice. Naruto's eyes flicker before they slowly move to the right, inching across her face until her red orbs enter his field of vision, and they lock eyes for the first time since Naruto had admitted to not telling her everything. Naruto couldn't place the look in Kurenai's eyes, but he could sense a hint of hurt along with disappointment within her ruby eyes. He almost looks away, but her gaze holds him, enrapturing him as it always did. He takes a shuddering breath as Kurenai speaks. I can try to understand why you wouldn't tell us about being capable of using the Kyuubi's Yuki. It is hard, but I can try to picture that within my mind, and I would be frightened of telling anyone myself. She takes a breath before continuing, seeing Naruto's slightly widened eyes. So I can try, Naruto-kun, but it still hurts to know you can't tell me everything, she admits softly. Naruto shakes his head. It's not that I didn't want to tell you, Kurenai-chan. It's just that. Again he trails off and attempts to look away, but Kurenai's gaze still stops him. Under her gaze he is powerless, and he can feel the truth being ripped from him without him even realizing what he is saying. I was so afraid that you would hate me for using the demon's Yuki, he says with a soft gasp from Kurenai and his own eyes widening as he continues speaking, a rush of emotion and purpose rushing through him. I know it was stupid, but I just couldn't help thinking that you would turn on me like everyone else had, he says, shame gracing his gaze as he still looked into her eyes. It was something I knew wouldn't happen, but deep down, I just couldn't help but think you would leave me like everyone else, Naruto admits in a whisper as his eyes turn away from Kurenai's own. He shamefully kicks at the ground, knowing that he had just hurt his girlfriend's feelings and knowing that he had done it hurt him. He waits for a few moments, expecting Kurenai to rebuke him for doubting her, but she just reaches forward and wraps him in a hug, pressing her lips to his furiously. So surprised is Naruto that his eyes widen comically, and he flails his arms slightly, but Kurenai's grip can't be broken, and she shoves her tongue into his mouth when he opened it to talk to her. He moaned into the kiss before she pulls her lips away from his, leaving a small bit of saliva to connect them. She licks her lips to clean them and fixes him with a smoldering yet fierce gaze as she speaks. "I will never leave you, Naruto-kun," she declares as she rests her forehead against his, forcing his gaze into her red eyes. He can see her emotions roiling behind them, and he feels his doubts of her crashing as she holds him close, despite their public setting. "Even if we don't work out," she says softly, her eyes softening as she sees Naruto's eyes dim from that thought. "We will always be teacher and student. Never forget that," she says vehemently. Naruto stares at her for a few moments. Silence reigned as the two stared into each other's eyes. "I'm sorry, Kurenai-chan," Naruto says softly. "I shouldn't have doubted you," he admits. Kurenai smiles softly. "It's okay, Naruto-kun. All relationships have their ups and downs. This was one of our downs. Let's try to avoid this, though," she says happily as she nips his lips and stands back up. Naruto nods and the two continue down the road toward the village gate, the air surrounding them much lighter and infinitely happier than the one that had been hanging since their departure from the Hokage's tower. Scene break. The gates of the village came into sight much sooner than Naruto would have liked. Despite being in such a public place, it had just been himself and Kurenai during their walk, and Naruto had been happy to relax his guard slightly while enjoying being in her presence once again. It seemed he got so little time to be with her recently. Despite all the time they spent training, they got very little time to spend just being boyfriend and girlfriend. He sighed as he attributed that to their lifestyles, something they had both chosen, and pushed the thoughts from his mind as he stepped closer to the group awaiting them. Naruto shuddered suddenly as he looked at one of the two people who were supposed to accompany him on his mission. "Ah, it's Nai-chan's boy toy," Anko shouted as she appeared behind him, crushing her bountiful breasts against his back and whispering huskily into his ear. "You know," she said, "we never did get to finish our conversation from before." She smirks at how he blushes and stiffens from her words and actions. Naruto froze as he feels Anko's breasts press up against his back, feeling those wonderful globes of flesh pressing against him. He can feel his heartbeat increase and his blood rushing through his veins as Anko's words filter through his head. He blushes even further as she rubs herself against him, and he hears Kyubi giggle in his mind. That stops his thoughts for a moment before Kyubi giggles again, and his eyes widen as he recognizes the tone which Kyubi's deep guttural voice usually holds now carries. Almost at the same time as he realizes this, does he hear Kurenai clear her throat, and he suddenly has a shiver run down his spine. "Anko!" Kurenai barks. Naruto is surprised at the tone which Kurenai holds, her normally melodious and smooth voice holding an unknown emotion as she speaks to the now frozen Anko. "Let go of Naruto-kun." Naruto blinks as, just as suddenly as she appeared, Anko disappears and reappears where she had been, chuckling sheepishly. "Sorry, Nai-chan," Anko says contritely, but the gleam in her eye has Naruto on edge as he turns to look at Kurenai, who was eyeing Anko with a cold fury in her gaze. His senses tingled as Anko spoke again. "Didn't mean to take your spot," she says suggestively. Kurenai, to her credit, only has a slight pink dust her cheeks as she glares at Anko. Naruto was blushing a deep red as his mind pictured Kurenai doing exactly what Anko had just been doing, and his heartbeat increases even more. His blood rushing downstairs, yet the giggle in his mind has him brought back to reality before anything could happen that would be noticeable. "Pervert," he states in his mind. Hearing a great snort, he smiles slightly. "I am not perverted, you stupid brat. I merely respect beauty in all its forms. It wasn't by my plan that females were the best thing ever to come into being on this world, with the exception of myself." The Kyubi retorts. Naruto isn't convinced but drops the point as he isn't interested in fighting with the Kyubi right before this mission. With this in mind, he turns to the final member of the team that is supposed to accompany him, and another smile graces his face. "Yugao-chan," he exclaims with enthusiasm, catching sight of the purple-haired Kunoichi now standing next to Anko, who was sticking her tongue out at Kurenai. Yugao smiles at Naruto. Wearing a normal jounin attire with a sword strapped across her back, she cuts an imposing figure, but the kindness in her eyes strikes Naruto. "Hello again, Naruto-kun. How have you been?" she asks. "Pretty good," he says before noticing the rakeage looking at him intently. He turns his gaze on the rakeage and spares a glance at Anko before stepping forward and bowing slightly. "I apologize for my teammate's attitude. Please excuse her," he says, which causes Anko and Kurenai to look over at him, even if he couldn't see them. The Reconnecting chuckles. Don't worry about it, Naruto. Be here will have a much more extravagant attitude by the time we reach the border. I hope you'll be able to put up with him. He says as he thumbs the guy who Naruto had noticed looked like the Reconnecting. Naruto nods after he stands back up and smiles lightly. Jiraiya steps in then, showing his leadership of the mission. Reconnecting-san, if you are ready, I believe we can set out now. He says, to which the Reconnecting nods. Well then, we will have a diamond form. Jiraiya says before the Reconnecting shakes his head and cuts him off. I'm not worried about your protection, Jiraiya-senin, he says dismissively. If anyone dares to attack a group made up of 3 S-rank shinobi, for A-rank shinobi, and 2 high C-rank shinobi, then they deserve the fate which befalls them. I wish to talk with Naruto-san during our walk, otherwise, I'm not concerned with your escort, he admits as he then begins to walk down the path away from Konoha. Jiraiya blinks before shrugging. Okay. Naruto, talk to the Reconnecting. Otherwise, just enjoy the leisurely walk we have. Jiraiya says as he pulls out his book and begins to write in it, glancing at the 5 kunoichi surrounding him, making it obvious what he was doing. Naruto glances at his supposed team. Recognizing the glares they were sending towards Jiraiya, he hurries forward and out of their range of ire. Naruto may not be completely social savvy, but he was aware of glares such as those, ones that Sakura had been giving him during the academy. Of course, Naruto speeding up, landed him directly next to the Reconnecting, who had B and that big-breasted blonde walking next to him. Naruto remained quiet for a few moments, walking in silence and feeling a small bit of tension in the air before saying, My name is Uzumaki Naruto. Pleasure to meet you, Reconnecting Dano. The Reconnecting glanced down at him with a smirk on his face. Don't stand on ceremony with me, Naruto. I'm not one of those old stuffy politicians that require you to show respect. The name's A and I'm the Yondaime Reconnecting. This is my brother, Killer B. He says as he gestured to the look-alike next to him. Naruto glanced at him and nodded in his direction, noticing the guy was definitely a Jinchuriki, as he nodded back. This here is one of my most trusted jounin and arguably the best Genjutsu user in Kimogakure, Samui. He says, pointing to the big-breasted blonde next to him. She gave him a cold stare in response to his nod of acknowledgement. Of course, you know Yujito already. He says as he gestures to the genin walking behind them slightly. Naruto nods in her direction and she smiles back at him. Naruto turns back to the Reconnecting and sent a look at Killer B which wasn't missed as he turns to the man. You're a Jinchuriki, aren't you? He asks quietly. The Reconnecting doesn't seem surprised that he would know. As a matter of fact, the only person whom didn't seem surprised Naruto had figured it out was Samui, who had taken a defensive posture upon hearing his question. Naruto didn't react to her and the Reconnecting waved her off. Killer B smiled at Naruto. Yo bro, are you glad to finally be meeting the mighty 8-0? He raps which causes Naruto to sweat drop. I see what you mean, A-san. Naruto deadpants as he looks at Killer B. The Reconnecting sighs lightly. So, he holds the 8 tails? Naruto asks quietly. The Reconnecting nods. Yeah. B can't seem to keep that secret when he meets another like him. So I requested to see you as we returned home so you could talk. He seemed quite interested in you. It was a little odd. On the way here both my Jinchuriki couldn't wait to meet you. The Reconnecting comments, stroking his beard, as he glances at Yujito then B. Though for different reasons. He says. Naruto chuckles. I'm quite popular, am I? He says with a hint of irony. Your spy apparently discovered what I did in Wave. I was trying to keep that secret. Naruto admits. The Reconnecting smirks down at him. Tough luck, kid, you ran across the best in the business. I almost didn't believe him when he first told me the story, nor even the Genjutsu you managed to catch him in for a split second before he broke it. The Reconnecting admitted. Naruto smiles, proud of his ability. Killer B stepped closer to Naruto, drawing his attention. He could feel the Reconnecting watching closely as B spoke. As we go around this bend, let's become friends, he says out of the blue. Naruto blinks in confusion before looking around and noticing they were at a bend in the road, but he guessed that Killer B wanted to become friends with him. We don't really know each other. You want to just become friends like that? Naruto asks a bit warily. He wasn't immediately trusting of people, but he wasn't opposed to the idea of gaining another friend, even one from another village. Killer B didn't seem deterred at all as he smiles at Naruto and thrusts out a fist, catching Naruto a bit off guard. To get over that hump, just give my fist a bump. He raps yet again. Naruto blinks before looking at B's fist and then back at B. A sliver of suspicion ran through him, but he felt no ill intention from the guy and his chakra wasn't circulating any more than before, so he smiled lightly and fisted his own fist. He thrust his knuckles against B's own lightly, tapping them, and he felt a connection for a split second. Through that connection, he grasped a feeling of contentedness along with the feeling of friendship and happiness overflowing from behind the guy's fists. He gasped lightly and stumbled before regaining his step and looking back at Killer B. His eyes shining as he smiles at the man before nodding and turning away from his newest friend. The Raikage stared sternly at Naruto. Naruto felt his gaze but figured the man would talk to him when he felt he had something to say. Naruto had nothing more to talk about with him. Initially, he had only wished to talk about how he was found out at Wave, which he admittedly got little information about. He looked back at Kurenai, Yugao, and Anko, noticing that Jiraiya now sported black eyes and was limping rather badly, though he still held a perverted grin as he scribbled in his book. Naruto shook his head as he saw the three kunoichi were whispering between the three of themselves. Though Naruto had no idea what they were talking about, he felt an odd shiver run down his spine as the three cast a glance at him. He smiled at them and they all returned it as they began conversing with themselves again, and Naruto turned back to the front. A thought occurred to Naruto and he put his hands in his favorite hand sign and out popped 10 clones who slightly surprised the surrounding shinobi until they hopped into the branches surrounding the path and created a loose perimeter. He felt the Raikage's gaze still on him and he spoke with a shrug. I figured it would be better to be cautious. He says, despite the fact that if any force big enough to harm us would be easily detected. He admits. The Raikage seemed satisfied, but his gaze was still set on Naruto as he continued walking, as if trying to figure something out about the blonde. The group continued in relative silence, Yugao, Kurenai, and Anko being the only ones who were really talking as Jiraiya and be muttered under their breaths to themselves. Yujito seemed satisfied to simply walk along in relative comfort, and the Raikage was not staring at Naruto but casting him glances every once in a while stroking his beard. It was the cold-looking blonde, Samui, who broke the silence. Naruto-san. She says, drawing the attention of Naruto and unknowingly to Naruto, Yugao, Anko, and Kurenai's attention as well. I am curious about something during your fight, she says, her cold exterior causing Naruto to raise an eyebrow at the fact she was speaking, but he nods his head to her. If it's something I can answer, I'll try, he says. Samui inclines her head to him. I'm curious about your fight with the Hyuga. Niji, I believe his name was. She says, causing Naruto to nod to affirm his name. I've never met anyone who attempted a Genjutsu against an active Byakugan. I was wondering what exactly drove you to attempting a Genjutsu. She states more than asks. Naruto blinks before looking back towards the road, taking in her question and thinking about his answer. Truthfully, he says after a pause. Turning one eye on her, he smiles lightly. I didn't expect it to work, he says, which causes the congregation to turn disbelieving stares on him, minus Yujito, who smirks in amusement. Having fought with him gave her a pretty good idea of how he worked. If you didn't expect it to work, then why did you use it? Samui asks, uncowingly voicing Kurenai's own question. Naruto smirks. If you don't try, then you never know what might work. He answers. Most of the congregation nods their head in agreement, acknowledging the wisdom of such a philosophy. Besides, he continues, if I couldn't trap him in a Genjutsu, I didn't think I could actually beat him. He admits lightly, my taijutsu is a new style, and the fact that I flipped him actually was one of the tricks that would really only work once on a taijutsu expert as Niji. On top of that, my ninjutsu was pathetically limited because of the circumstances. Naruto says, if you couldn't trap him in a Genjutsu, what would you have done then? Kurenai asks almost immediately after that, fixing him with a questioning gaze. Naruto shrugs, done the best with what I had and then either forfeited or been beaten. Despite the fact that the proctor said it was life or death, you couldn't actually get killed because the proctor would declare the match before anyone is in real danger. Naruto responds, in the real world, I would have retreated or used traps or cover to attempt to beat him, but if you think about it, that arena is much too suited to straightforward battle types than the ones who like to use stealth or traps. He says as he looks at the sky, contemplating on the stadium he had fought in. Most of the shinobi are agreeing with him, but most genin aren't known for anything other than straightforward tactics. You said your jutsu was narrowed down, Why is that? Samui asks. Naruto comes back from his contemplating to fix her with a slightly narrowed stare. I'm sharing information with potential enemies. Samui-san, do you really expect me to answer that question? He says to her, which she takes in stride, not even offering an apology for the offense she presented to Naruto. That is true, Naruto-kun, but… Yujito speaks, sparing a glance at the Reconnecting who nods. But we are in the process of making an alliance with the two of our villages, which would benefit your village highly, especially since you just lost your only allies. She says. Naruto turns an eye on Jiraiya, looking for confirmation. Jiraiya nods to Naruto and he sighs as he looks back at them. I won't tell you that, but I will tell you the method I used against Neji. Would that help Samui-san? He asks. Samui shrugs. I was curious about the Genjutsu, but if you explain how you managed to get a Byakugan user into a Genjutsu, I suppose that would be even better. She admits, very well. Please remember this act of good faith when the treaty is placed before you, then A-san. Naruto says, which causes the Reconnecting to smirk as he nods lightly, apparently pleased with Naruto's attitude. I tried to anger Neji in the beginning. He admits. By doing this, it served a twofold purpose. I had done extensive research in the Konoha archives to figure out what would be the best way to combat a Hyuga. I'm sure you are aware of the best method, Naruto states, allowing for one of the Kumo ninja to speak up. Fight them from a distance and tire them out before closing in for the kill. The Reconnecting supplies, causing Naruto and Jiraiya to nod. Exactly, but I could only carry so many weapons on myself and, though I have the chakra to be able to cast non-stop jutsu, just as B and Yujito do, I didn't have the correct jutsu to use. He admits. So, I researched about their bloodline and discovered something that would help me. He stops for a moment, wondering if he should really be sharing this with enemies, despite how friendly they were when Jiraiya gives him another subtle nod. He idly wondered why Jiraiya was so supportive of Kumo but continues nonetheless. I discovered that their perception while using the Byakugan is reliant upon their ability to remain calm and collected, hence the reason they seem like such sticks in the mud. He says to a few giggles and chuckles. He smiles lightly as well. Anyways, so I figured getting him angry would make him sloppy plus lose his focus to where I might be able to catch him in a Genjutsu because his perception would be messed up. Naruto says, I was honestly surprised he fell so easily into the Genjutsu. I was expecting a much longer and harder fight than what he put up. He admits. Samui blinked. So, you weren't trying to obscure and confuse him with the amount of chakra you pumped into the arena as you used the Kage Bunshin and the Genjutsu? She asks with a hint of surprise. Naruto blinked in surprise himself before bringing a finger up to his chin and thinking for a moment. You know, that probably is why my Genjutsu caught so easily. I hadn't even thought of that. He says, which causes Samui to sweat drop and Yujito to giggle at Naruto. Naruto blushes slightly as he looks down. Needless to say, it was still an impressive plan even without that extra part. You should be proud of your pupil, Jiraiya-senin. The Reconnecting praises. Jiraiya shakes his head. You really have to thank Kurenai-san for his abilities. I taught him the ninjutsu he knows plus a few more things, but most of what he just showcased was what Kurenai trained him in. He says as he waves in Kurenai's direction. Kurenai smiles at the praise from the Reconnecting and Jiraiya, both respectable and powerful shinobi. Samui turns an eye on Kurenai and nods to her. Konoha's Genjutsu mistress. Not surprising you are training the only Genjutsu talent in your village. Such a shame our branch doesn't hold more interest. She says, to which Kurenai nods. Naruto smiles lightly as the ice seemed to be broken from the group and they continue walking down the path. Samui dropping back to converse every once in a while with the Konoha Kunoichi and Yujito sped up to walk next to Naruto. Jiraiya, B, and the Reconnecting relax a bit more as they continue on their way to the border. The Reconnecting and his group were all standing next to the border leading to the small strip of Oto land they had to cover before reaching their homeland of Lightning Country. Naruto and the Konoha ninja stood looking at them as they were about to set out. It had taken almost 3 days to reach here because of the sedate pace they had been traveling. Nothing had happened as they traveled, predictably because of the size and strength of their group. No one had tried to pick a fight and even bandits had seemingly strayed away from them. Naruto smiled as B walked up to him. I'll see you later, B, he said as he held his fist out for another bump, which B quickly tapped with his own fist. It's been fun, but we've gotta run. B rapped as he turned and left Naruto. Naruto shaking his head as the rest of the ninja groaned at his rapping. They had all been subject to his rapping for the past 2 days, and they were all, understandably, tired of it. Samui and Kurenai were speaking a bit away from the group while the rest of the group just waited patiently, until Yujito walked up to Naruto, a hint of nervousness in her stance. Something Naruto picked up on as he smiled reassuredly while speaking. "Thanks for fighting with me, Yujito-chan, and helping me. You were the reason we won." He admits. Yujito blushes slightly and she smiles. "You were pretty good yourself, Naruto. I just helped," she said. Her eyes darted around, before she locked them on his own blue eyes, which held a hint of worry for her. "Thank you for helping me, Naruto-kun, despite how I treated you at first," she said quickly before darting forward, laying a quick kiss on his cheek before turning and dashing away from the group with a furious blush. Naruto blinked in confusion as Jiraiya grinned perversely. Meanwhile, the Raikage and Be both chuckled as they looked at their fellow ninja become so flustered over a kiss. Samui, having turned and seen the kiss with Kurenai moments before, glanced between Yujito and Naruto a few times before turning and following Yujito, as did the rest of the Raikage group, while Naruto still stood in shock. Yugao and Anko both sucked in their breath as they grinned at Naruto. The only person without a grin or a smile was Kurenai, who was staring intently at Naruto's face. Of course, this led to Naruto snapping out of his staring at the retreating Yujito's back to turn eyes full of apprehension with a small hint of fear towards Kurenai's stare, somehow knowing that what just happened, though beyond his control, had somehow triggered something. Naruto stared back into her eyes for a full 10 seconds, tension mounting in the air, before she turned away. "I believe we need to get going, Naruto-kun, Yugao-chan, Anko-chan. We have a mission we must complete," she said, the tone in her voice causing Naruto to slump slightly, while Yugao and Anko looked on confusedly, though they both suspected something. Jiraiya lost his grin, mumbling under his breath as he turned to leave himself. "Damn Gaki getting to go on a mission with 3 of the hottest kunoichi in the leaf. Why did Sarutobi-sensei send them with him? He should have sent them with me, then we could have," he lamented to an immediate 3 sets of glares. Naruto himself barely heard Jiraiya's laments as the man beat a hasty retreat from 3 sets of glares. He wasn't sure he wanted any more. Naruto's eyes were set on Kurenai's back, wondering if she was angry at him or if he had done something wrong. By the tone in her voice, she didn't seem angry, yet she seemed tense, as if something had irritated her, but she didn't want to let it show. He got barely any time to contemplate what he could do to get her to release what irritated her when Jiraiya addressed him. "Naruto," he barked at him, causing Naruto to break away from Kurenai's back to lock eyes with his official teacher. "Don't forget to continue your training while you can. I'll be gone for a little while checking my spy network," he said as he walked towards the foliage. "I'll test you when I get back, so make sure you work hard. If you do well enough, maybe I'll even teach you an A-rank jutsu," he tempted as he disappeared into the foliage, quickly being swallowed up by the thick brush and trees surrounding the area. Naruto nodded at his teacher despite the fact he couldn't see him. With his teacher gone, he looked at the experienced team he was supposed to use on this mission. He was glad to have all of them here. He knew Yugao was a very skilled Genjutsu user while being in ANBU, so her skills were nothing to scoff at. Kurenai he knew explicitly, having fought her before himself while also learning from her. Anko was the only one whom he didn't know much about, though the way she held herself and the little he was able to grasp while he had seen her told him she was a deadly opponent. It helped that he could feel each of them had sizable chakra pools, though he felt an odd chakra being suppressed next to Anko, and it was annoying him now that they were out of the enemy's earshot. As a matter of fact, now that he concentrated on it, it felt something like what Sasuke now had. His eyes widened slightly and his eyes flashed over to the kunoichi's shoulder, wondering why she would have something like what was bestowed upon Sasuke by Orochimaru. Naruto opened his mouth to ask the question when Kurenai's voice came from her still-turned body. "We need to move so we can be close to where the bandits are supposed to be stationed currently. We don't want the trail to run cold," she said, that same slightly irritated tone in her voice. "We'll have to travel like shinobi. Let's go," she said as she prepared to jump. "Wait, Kurenai-desh," Yugao said as Kurenai jumped into the foliage, Anko hot on her heels. Naruto's shoulders slumped slightly again as he felt like it was his fault that she was irritated. Yugao sighed lightly, running a hand through her hair as she looked over at Naruto. Noting his slumped shoulders, she grinned slightly. Sorry, Naruto-kun. I don't know what's going on with Kurenai-chan, but let's get moving and we can talk while we jump, okay? She asks, to which Naruto nods and both of them jump into the trees, following their comrades' fading chakra signatures. Scene break. Naruto and Yugao jumped through the trees, putting on a bit of steam to get close enough to Kurenai and Anko, whom seemed to be talking quietly among themselves, to see them but not hear them. Naruto watched as the two went back and forth, though it seemed Anko was just speaking incessantly about one thing or another as Kurenai would only nod her head slightly every half a minute or so. He sighed once again as he noted that she wasn't even really taking in what Anko was saying, as she continued to lead them towards the last known destination of the bandits. Naruto spared a glance at his purple-haired comrade and felt he couldn't take the oppressive air that surrounded him because of his feelings of guilt. He couldn't figure out why Kurenai was irritated, but he was pretty sure he was the cause of it. He couldn't talk to her like he wanted with Anko and Yugao here though, so he had to settle for, hopefully, speaking with her tonight. So, Hokage chose you for this mission? Naruto asked with a hint of curiosity. Yugao turned to him and nodded. Yeah, he thought my Genjutsu would be a good idea if we could combine it with the Genjutsu you have been using. She answered him. By the way, you are technically the leader of this mission, so if you need us to do something, just tell us. We will be counting on you to come up with a mission plan or to ask us for advice when you need it. She informed him, to his own widened eyes. Naruto's mind raced. He was a genin. What was he doing commanding 2 jounins and an ANBU operative? He didn't have the experience to do that. His eyes glanced over to Kurenai and Anko. Neither seemed to have heard what Yugao said, and he spoke quietly. Why would I be the leader? Any of you would be better suited for it, he admitted to Yugao. Not to mention that I am only a genin while you 3 have years of experience and 2 ranks between me, he said. Yugao frowned lightly. Apparently, the Fire Lord assumed that you wouldn't have any superior officers on your mission. Her frown increased. Stupid really, thinking 4 genins could handle 1,500 bandits. They aren't very hard opponents, but there is a limit, she stated vehemently, quickly getting back on topic. But he decreed you would lead it. Even though that is usually the Hokage's decision, the Fire Lord does have ways of pressuring Hokage-sama into doing what he wants, she explained. Naruto nodded his head at Yugao. Don't worry, Naruto-kun, you have a good head on your shoulders and you aren't arrogant. You will ask our advice if you think you need it. I have no doubt you won't ignore our advice either, so it works out, she admitted to Naruto, smiling thankfully at her. Yugao glanced at him and smiled as well as she continued. Besides, I protected you enough when you were young to know the type of person you are. Normally, I would think you would charge and head first. But Kurenai-chan has managed to get you a bit level-headed, and you aren't the type to disregard advice you think is coming from someone wiser than you, she said to Naruto's nodding. That's why Kurenai, Anko and myself decided we would let you get a feel for commanding others while you're with us, because we'll be able to suggest if something should be changed, she told him. If something happens which you're unprepared for or can't handle, we'll be there to help, she admitted with a smile to him. Naruto smiled back at her with gratefulness in his face as he fell quiet, contemplating on leading his first mission. But Yugao wasn't silent for long. That's why I was curious about Kurenai's actions, she informed him. She was the one who suggested we let you lead even if one of us would do better, but she just took charge. I wonder why, she said almost to herself, but Naruto looked forward again. Watching Kurenai's stiff form jump from tree limb to tree limb, he sighed. She's irritated about something, Yugao-chan, he said quietly. Yugao turned a slightly surprised glance at him as she spoke. How can you tell that? She asked. Naruto glanced at Kurenai before turning to Yugao. She's slightly stiff while she isn't paying any attention to what Anko-san says. Also, the tone in her voice was slightly strained when she was giving us the orders to move out, he said in an almost list-like manner, making sure his comrade understood what he was saying. She's irritated about something, but I can't figure out what, he admitted. Yugao blinked before looking at Kurenai again and shaking her head slightly. That's impressive, Naruto-kun. Naruto blinked in confusion, turning a questioning gaze on Yugao. I mean the fact you can understand what's wrong with her just from hearing her speak and the way she moves. Yugao turned back to Naruto, a calculating look in her eye as she scrutinized Naruto. I've been her friend for the past 5 years and I still can't pick that up unless someone else points it out to me, she admitted to Naruto's gaze. Naruto smiled as a light pink dusted his cheeks from the praise and from the slight suspicion he felt Yugao had. Well, I spent a lot of time with her, he said, hoping to have her accept his reasoning. After a brief moment, Yugao nodded hesitantly, and they continued on in silence. Scene break. The rest of their trip was spent in relative silence. Anko chattered on with Kurenai, but Naruto didn't want to speak with Yugao because she kept shooting glances between himself and Kurenai, and she didn't bother to hide it either. He knew she suspected something, but he didn't know exactly what she thought. Of course, it mattered little if Yugao knew about his relationship, at least to Naruto considering how she had protected him when he was younger, but Naruto didn't know if Kurenai would like for her to know. So, he was reduced to following the irritated Kurenai and chatterbox Anko in silence, enduring Yugao's glances every few minutes. They arrived at the town closest to where the bandits were supposedly camped earlier than expected because of Kurenai's set pace. Though none of the team were even breathing hard, it was obvious that they had pushed themselves from the slight slumping of each of their shoulders. When Kurenai went to lead them into the town, Yugao saw her chance to remind Kurenai of her suggestion and spoke up. "Kurenai," she said, causing her to pause and turn to look at Yugao with a slightly curious look as Anko also raised an eyebrow looking at Yugao. Naruto had tried to catch Kurenai's eye, but she avoided his own. Yugao narrowed her eyes slightly. "Yes, Yugao?" Kurenai asked. Even noting Yugao's eyes, her tone did not waver. "I think it's time we let Naruto-kun assume leadership," she said as she shifted on her feet. Looking directly at Kurenai, Naruto noticed Anko frown and assumed she didn't like the thought of having himself in command. Truthfully, he didn't feel he could lead them as well as any of them could, but he also knew he would try his best if they told him to do so. "Why would we let the Gaki lead?" Anko said with a small scoff. Naruto's own eyes narrowed. He hated being called spoiled. He doesn't have the experience, and he doesn't even have a rank that would require him to lead someone else. There's no reason to let him lead when we can just say he deferred to us in the report, she reasoned. Naruto could, at least, tell that her logic was sound even if he felt she was looking down on him with the way she turned a side glance at him, watching his reaction to her words. Only Yugao noticed the flicker of emotion within Kurenai's ruby orbs as she heard Anko's declaration, but Yugao countered quickly. "We already talked about all of this, Anko," she said, sending a small glare at the offending jounin, which was returned. "He may not need the experience now, but it would be invaluable for when he does get the promotion. Besides," Yugao spared a smile to Naruto, who seemed to brighten. "With us here, it is less likely he will be traumatized from a bad decision, and if he does make a bad decision, he'll be able to learn from his mistakes," she said as Naruto nodded slightly. Of course, Anko opened her mouth to retort again as Yugao pulled the final punch, watching as Kurenai's eyes remained locked with her own. "This was all your idea in the first place, Kurenai?" she accused. Kurenai blinked before turning around. "Very well, Naruto-kun," she said, even with her back turned to him. "Where shall we head the night?" she asked. Naruto, suddenly the bearer of a single light glare and a reassuring smile, scratched his head in confusion. A hotel?" he asked hopefully. Kurenai nodded as Anko stuck her tongue out at Naruto. "I still don't think you should lead," she said as she turned and then walked closer to Kurenai as she herself walked towards the town. Naruto walked forwards, looking around at the only other town he had been to other than Wave or Konoha. He noticed that the village wasn't very big, yet it was sizable. There was one main street on which most of the passing travelers would use, but there were a myriad of side streets leading to the houses of the natives. There actually turned out to be only one hotel in the village, and the group entered the modest-looking building. As they entered into the small lobby, the three kunoichi, albeit one reluctantly, turned to Naruto expectantly. Naruto looked around the lobby, taking in the unfamiliar sights of the hotel without noticing the three kunoichi stairs. A pointed clearing of a throat brought Naruto to the three women's stairs, and he blushed slightly in embarrassment. "What's wrong?" he asked sheepishly. "You need to get rooms for us, Naruto-kun," Kurenai said, her ruby orbs traveling over to the front desk as she looked around the hotel herself. Naruto blinked before looking at the front desk, which had the only other person in the room behind it, and then around the rest of the room before looking back at Kurenai. "How do I do that?" he asked hesitantly. Anko rolled her eyes. "Great, our leader doesn't even know how to get us rooms in a hotel." she whined, seemingly intent on undermining Naruto's leadership at every turn. Naruto's eyes narrowed, but Kurenai stepped in. Stop complaining, Anko. You agreed to this too, and I won't have you undermining him on his first try at leading a squad, she said. Apparently Yugao's talk had erased some of her irritation. This is a learning experience, and just because you don't like someone younger than you ordering you around doesn't mean you can just keep insulting Naruto. Grow up, she said a bit harshly. Anko fell silent, looking at Kurenai with some slightly widened eyes as Yugao sighed and Kurenai looked slightly apologetic. Naruto's head slowly panned around between the three kunoichi before sighing and heading to the counter to ask the only other person in the room how he was to gain lodging for the night. Welcome to the Fluffy Rabbit Hotel. My name is Kanzuya. How may I help you, sir? The clerk named Kanzuya asked as Naruto's eye twitched from the name of the hotel. Naruto stared at the man for a few moments before. How many people laugh at you for what you just said? He asked. The man looked down, an aura of depression surrounding him. Almost everyone, he whispered. Naruto shook his head. Naruto said, looking back at the three kunoichi, whom were conversing amongst themselves in hushed voices. I need enough rooms for the four of us to sleep, Naruto finally said as he looked back at the clerk. The clerk looked down at some piece of paper before looking back up. I am sorry, sir, but the only rooms we have are 2 rooms with 2 beds in each, he said apologetically. Naruto grimaced but nodded, looking back at the women. He could sleep outside if he needed to. I guess I'll take them, he said to the clerk, whom told him the price, and Naruto quickly paid, getting the room keys and numbers before thanking the man, learning about how to check in and out by asking the man before he turned back to the women on his squad. He walked over to the stairs and began to climb them, his team following shortly after. None of them spoke a word as Naruto looked down at the keys and then walked towards the hallway that held their 2 rooms. Of course, as they stopped in front of the first room, Naruto stopped and smiled sheepishly. Well, they only had 2 rooms left, and so. He trailed off with a bit of a blush, as understanding dawned in the kunoichi's eyes. Naruto was unprepared for the gleam that entered Anko's eyes, however. I'll sleep with Naruto-kun, she offered as she sauntered forward, laying herself across his shoulders yet again. Naruto blinked. Anko's constant mood swings were starting to get to him. I'll make sure Naruto-kun gets a good night's sleep, she purred to Naruto, which had shivers, not unlike the ones Kurenai's own husky voice induced, running down his back as his own eyes widened. That is unnecessary, Anko-chan. As Naruto-sensei, I will be sharing the room with him, Kurenai said in a clipped tone as she stared particularly hard at Anko's current state. Anko's lips stuck out as she pouted slightly, looking back up at Kurenai. Mao, Nai-chan just wants to have some fun with her boy toy, she whined, that odd gleam in her eyes shining through, which caused Naruto to recognize it as the same gleam he got in his eyes when he planned a prank. I like this one, Kyubi said from its cage, its attention obviously on Anko. Naruto mentally scoffed, but didn't respond. To Naruto and Kurenai's credit, neither of them blushed more than a light pink on their cheeks, which brought both Anko's and Yugao's attention regardless. However, Kurenai stopped any teasing or questions before they could be voiced. Well, since Naruto is the one in the lead of this mission, perhaps we should allow him to make the sleeping arrangements, she offered, bringing the attention back to Naruto. Naruto blinked slightly before sighing and saying, no offense, Anko-chan or Yugao-chan, but I know Kurenai-sensei better, so I would feel better if she was sharing with me. Is that okay? He asked. Yugao didn't seem to care either way and accepted Naruto's reasoning with a small smile and a nod while Anko pouted at him. Ah, Naruto-kun doesn't want the sexy and amazing Anko-chan to keep him company at night, she whined sexily. Naruto coughed and blushed, stammering his response as Anko smirked. Fine, fine. I can tell when I'm not wanted, Anko said as she danced away from Naruto suddenly. She waved the key to her and Yugao's room in her hands as she began to walk away with Yugao, calling back over her shoulder as Naruto and Kurenai moved to enter their own room. Don't have too much fun, she said as she began to laugh. Unknown to her, Kurenai now sported a slightly heavier blush and Naruto was blushing slightly, wondering what exactly Anko may be talking about. Naruto fumbled with the key before fitting it into the keyhole and opening the room, showing a bathroom and a TV along with 2 double beds and a chair to sit in. Kurenai and Naruto moved into the room, Naruto taking the bed closer to the window and Kurenai taking the one closer to the door. As soon as Kurenai and Naruto finished sitting upon their beds, the tension was back in the air. A feeling of awkwardness along with a simmering feeling beneath the surface assaulted Naruto's senses. He didn't know what was causing such an air, as he had been relatively relaxed around Kurenai since he had started training under her. The only time there had been any tension had been when he thought she was lingering upon him when they had been training. Naruto's eyes sought Kurenai's and their gazes locked. Naruto could see Kurenai keeping a tight leash on whatever it was that was bothering her. Conflicting emotions fighting within her, yet he couldn't pinpoint most of the emotions she was feeling. He felt Kyuubi stir within him, somehow being affected by the tension layering the air. Naruto blinked and opened his mouth to ask Kurenai what was wrong when she suddenly stood up. "I'm going to take a shower, Naruto-kun. Anko-chan is going to send out some summons to scout the land and the bandit camp, so we'll be making our plans tomorrow morning. Please go to bed early tonight," she said as she broke contact with his eyes and turned to enter the bathroom with a sealing scroll in hand. Hearing the door to the bathroom close, Naruto sighed and laid himself out on his bed, wondering what exactly it was that was bothering his teacher and girlfriend. Scene break. It didn't seem much longer that Naruto heard the water in the bathroom being turned off and Kurenai stepping out of the tub, the smack of her wet feet on the tiled floor of the bathroom bringing Naruto back from the small nap it looked like he took as he sat up and rubbed his eyes while yawning. Naruto's eyes panned over to the door of the bathroom, the sound of it opening drawing his attention, only to be struck slightly dumb by the sight he now encountered. Despite seeing Kurenai naked, twice so far, he had never seen her dressed in something so form-fitting, even during their dates. So, it was little surprise that Naruto's eyes were glued to Kurenai's form as she stepped out of the bathroom, rubbing her hair with a towel and wearing a tight red tank top that showed an even more impressive display of her generous cleavage. To complement it, she wore some black shorts that stopped about halfway down her thighs, also form-fitting. All in all, she showed a little bit more skin than normal, yet the appeal that the outfit had on Naruto was obvious, especially when Kurenai noticed he had been staring at her since she had stepped out of the bathroom. Kurenai's lips twitched upwards as she turned her gaze on Naruto's roving eyes. She didn't reprimand him, as he had expected. Instead, she merely walked over and sat on her bed, her back to him as she continued toweling her hair. "The bathroom is free, Naruto-kun," she said as she pulled her hair around and over her shoulder, showing her slim neck and creamy skin while brushing her hair. Naruto blinked as he registered how loud his gulp had been when Kurenai had spoken and quickly looked away from her body. "Thanks, Kurenai-chan," he said as he stood and made his way over to the bathroom himself. After taking a long and relaxing shower, one which took a considerable amount of time because of Naruto basking in the warm water, Naruto stepped out of the shower. He quickly toweled himself off and brushed his teeth before combing out his hair with his fingers. Throwing on his sleeping clothes, a simple t-shirt and shorts combination, he opened the door to a darkened room. Frowning slightly, Naruto stepped out of the bathroom and took a look over at Kurenai's bed. Noting the even breathing of his sensei, he sighed softly as he quietly slipped from the bathroom to his own bed and laid down to sleep himself. Scene break. It was a few hours later that Naruto grumbled silently to himself as he tossed over onto his side, unable to find sleep. There were a few reasons he couldn't sleep. Chief among them was the tension he could feel with Kurenai, but he was also full of energy tonight for some reason he couldn't identify. He had spent the whole day running at almost full speed, yet he felt rejuvenated enough to where he was still willing to go. Moving his gaze over to his sensei, he wondered why exactly she had been so irritated during their trip. He had a feeling it had something to do with Uchiha, yet he couldn't find any reason for her to be annoyed by that. I mean, it wasn't like she kissed him on the lips or something. It was just a friendly goodbye kiss, right? Deciding that mulling it over would never get him closer to an answer, he decided to try and see if Kurenai was awake. "Kurenai-chan?" he whispered quietly, not wishing to wake her if she wasn't half asleep. Kurenai's lone eye opened and locked onto Naruto's form. She spoke from her bed. "Yes, Naruto-kun?" Naruto faltered slightly, not knowing exactly how to broach the topic of why she had been so irritated. Looking at her, he could tell she was expecting a question to be asked, especially since he had woken her up slightly. He gulped slightly before deciding to just jump straight into it and hope for the best since Kurenai had said honesty was an important part of their relationship. "Why were you so irritated when we left the Kumo border?" he asked with curiosity in his voice. Naruto kept his eyes on Kurenai's own as she stared back at him. Naruto could feel Kurenai's body tense and her eyes narrowed slightly as she lay in her bed. Naruto just laid on his bed, awaiting an answer. Eventually, Kurenai spoke slowly, as if weighing her own words. "It's nothing, Naruto-kun," she said. Naruto frowned, unsatisfied. "It wasn't nothing, Kurenai-chan," he insisted. Kurenai's eyes narrowed slightly, unseen by Naruto, and she shifted in her bed. Naruto kept staring at her, pushing his pleading to her through his eyes. Kurenai sighed softly, turning away from Naruto. It was just a little lingering resentment from the Hyuga incident. Nothing to worry about, Naruto-kun, Kurenai finally said, dismissal in her voice. Naruto knew that Kurenai intended for it to end there. That tone in her voice was an obvious mark that she didn't want to speak about it anymore. Unfortunately, Naruto knew something else was wrong because she wasn't being completely honest. He frowned and looked at Kurenai's back again. The answer might not be the whole truth, but Naruto felt that it was part of it. So he decided leaving it alone until Kurenai wanted to tell him was fine. But he did think that his kiss with Yujito might not be the actual reason any longer. With that reassuring thought, Naruto slowly drifted to sleep. Scene break. Naruto was woken when Kurenai shifted in her own bed the next morning, moving and stretching herself out. Naruto smiled as he heard her moan slightly as her back popped back into place and her muscles stretched out. Naruto smiled gently as he watched Kurenai turn her head and look at him. "Time to get up, Naruto-kun," she said quietly while standing. She turned and headed towards the bathroom. "Anko-chan and Yugao-chan should be here shortly with Anko-chan's information. Then you can start planning your first mission," she said as she stepped into the bathroom to change. Naruto blinked at what Kurenai said, the situation hitting him a little more fully than yesterday as Kurenai told him he would be the one doing the planning, unlike what had been happening in his previous missions. Naruto sighed as he sat up, stretching himself as well while running a hand through his hair, something he had made a habit of when he was distressed over something, especially after his hair had grown to its new length. Quickly standing, Naruto dressed himself and answered the door as a knock sounded on it. He nodded his head in greeting as Anko and Yugao headed further into the room themselves. Anko flung herself onto Kurenai's bed as Yugao remained standing while Kurenai emerged from the bathroom. Naruto excused himself and entered the bathroom, brushing his teeth, combing his hair and splashing some water on his face before drying it and exiting the bathroom to find a map spread out on a table that had been set up between their beds. Walking over to the open spot next to Yugao and across from Kurenai, Naruto looked down to find a map of the surrounding map with 3 camps and their current village marked along with 2 other villages in the area. He turned his gaze up to Anko as she spoke. "This is the surrounding area, Naruto-kun," she said, her earlier hesitance to Naruto leading apparently mollified since the short talk Kurenai and Yugao had with her as Naruto secured their rooms. "This is where we are now," she says, pointing to the obvious markings of home village. "These are the 3 camps of the bandits." She waves her hand at the 3 encampments. "This one," she points to the one farthest from their town, "is the largest and best fortified of their camps. My summons found that the guy's head we need is living there off the spoils they have raided. It's roughly 900 of their forces in there," she informed the group, pointing to the next camp between their current town and another smaller one. "This one is the smallest, roughly 250 in there, but there does seem to be 1 Chunin level chakra in that camp," she said to nods from the rest of her group. Finally, the other camp, which holds close to 350 of their people, this one also carries a Chunin level chakra. Surrounding each of the camps are a weak series of traps that are capable of being discovered by most genin. So either those chakra signatures are just abnormally large for civilians or those shinobi are no good at traps. Anko said as she looked at the map. "That's all my summons found out." The group fell silent, each looking at the map with contemplative gazes until, almost simultaneously, all 3 women turned to Naruto, and almost immediately wondering why he looked so frustrated. They sat in silence, watching Naruto grow increasingly frustrated, as evidenced by Naruto's eyebrows as they scrunched up even more than a hand went to playing with his hair's end before Yugao spoke up from next to him. "Treat it like a prank, Naruto-kun. she suggested, to Naruto's darting eyes and thankful smile. Surprisingly, Naruto's eyes almost immediately brightened as he looked at the camps yet again. "All right," he said, to most of the kunoichi's surprise at how fast he recovered. "Here's what I want to do." He pointed at the medium-sized camp. "I want to attack this camp with a few Kage Bunshin, just enough to cause enough confusion and panic where they send for aid." He moved both hands to points between the three camps, one between the smallest and the one they would attack and one between the biggest and the one they would attack. "I want one of you at each of these points, watching how many they send from each camp and whether that chakra signature moves from the smallest camp," he said to their slight nods. "What about the other one of us, Naruto-kun?" Kurenai asked. Naruto grinned. "You're gonna be with me, we're gonna stay close enough to send in a few more of my clones, but I don't want to be that close without some backup if we get caught," he said to the women's nods yet again. "Once we find out how they move their numbers, I'll have the Kage Bunshin run into cover and dispel. I want to do this for all three camps." The three kunoichi shared a look. "Why?" Anko asked, seemingly suspicious of something. Naruto spared her a glance and looked back down at the map. "Once we figure out their movements depending on which camp we attack, I want to set up traps between them. When we attack them for real, we'll attack the one most likely to divert the most amount of troops away from the main camp so we have less of a fight there," he explained, glancing up at their calculative looks. He continued, "We'll decide on who attacks where once we get that done, but I think that either Yugao or Anko will come with me to the biggest camp for the real attack, where Kurenai-sensei will take one camp and whichever one does not come with me will take the other." He nods in satisfaction. "Well, what do you think?" he asks as he sits back, confident in his plan. "We lose the element of surprise," Anko said almost instantly. "Why would you want to warn them we are coming like that?" she asks. Kurenai and Yugao hold their comments, looking at Naruto for the answer. Naruto glances at them before pointing back at the camps. "Because most of these camps are too much for one person to handle, and we can't just rush in blindly only to get blindsided by reinforcements from the other camps. If we attacked immediately, we would have to attack the main camp to complete the mission. That's probably the worst camp to attack. It would result in more risk than my plan," he explains. Kurenai and Yugao nod as Anko smirks. "Intelligent little gaki," she says. "I like it," Yugao said. "So do I," Kurenai says as she nods. "Though it seems kind of familiar," Yugao says as she looks at the map, then Naruto. Naruto grins sheepishly. "That's 'cause I used this when I pranked the Inuzuka clan. That was how I managed to get into their compound," Naruto said with a small smile. Anko and Kurenai chuckle as Yugao's eyes widen. "Wait a minute. You were the one who had them all complaining about stink bombs?" Yugao asked. "The ANBU could never figure out who did it. How'd you manage past their guards? Just this shouldn't have enabled you to get past their noses?" she asked curiously. Naruto chuckled, looking away from the women. "That's my secret," he said with a smile on his face to Yugao's slight pout, while Kurenai and Anko's chuckles increased in volume. Once the women had stopped chuckling, Naruto looked back at the map. "Once we're done with the middle camp, I want to try the smallest camp next and then leave the biggest camp for last," he said. A look of thought appeared on his face as he looked at the map, but whatever he had thought of was apparently dismissed as he continued. "I doubt that the biggest camp would be viable to attack, but we should still see what happens," he said as he sat down on his bed. "When do you want to do the attacks?" Anko asked, looking at Naruto. Naruto thought about it for a second. "When do you think would be best, Anko?" he asked. Anko blinked before a small smirk appeared on her face as she looked at him, acknowledging his looking for guidance, even if he probably already knew what she was going to say. "Early morning for the raids to figure out their deployments, but twilight for your actual plan," she supplied. Naruto looked at her intently, wondering if he should disagree with her. Kurenai and Yugao seemed comfortable to sit back and watch them. Naruto looked at the two whom had remained quiet. "What do you two think?" he asked. Kurenai nodded almost instantly. "I think Anko's times are the best times to attack." Naruto nodded and turned to Yugao. "I think we should switch it around. Attack at twilight for the raids and early morning for your actual attack." Anko and Kurenai looked at her with a small bit of surprise, and Naruto raised an eyebrow in question. "If we attack in the early morning for the actual plan, then we are more liable to run into hungover opponents along with ones whom don't have a full night's rest. Tired opponents are more likely to make mistakes," especially for traps, Yugao explained. Her 3 comrades nodded in understanding, but it was Naruto who spoke up in opposition. But for Anko's times we run into tired opponents as well, perhaps even more so because the entire camp is up all day. Naruto said. Yugao tipped her head in acknowledgement of his point. Plus, if we set traps, I think the bandits are more likely to set them off during twilight or night than in the early morning. Again, Yugao nodded as Anko and Kurenai were both watching where he was going with his thoughts, as he seemed to just be talking to himself. Not to mention the night would be better for retreat if we need to, right? He asks almost to himself. A pretty thorough breakdown of the pros and cons of those times, Kurenai praised, looking at Naruto. What time do you want to go with though? She asked. Naruto's mouth thinned into a line as he thought about how he wanted to answer the question. Remaining quiet as Naruto deliberated, the kunoichi seemed content to let Naruto figure out exactly what he wanted to do. Finally, I think we should go with Anko's plan. It seems to have slightly more advantages than Yugao's. He turned to Yugao. Sorry, he said, not wanting to offend her for not picking her plan. Yugao waved him off. I'm capable of seeing my plan's own flaws. Don't apologize for not choosing mine, and never do that to your subordinates. It would cause them to think they can oppose you because they could take your guilt to manipulate you if they really wish to. The chain of command must always remain clear. She warns. Naruto blinks. Would fellow Konoha ninja really try that? Naruto asks almost mindlessly as he pictures that in his mind. Anko scoffs lightly. Think about the Uchiha. If you apologize to him, do you really think he wouldn't try to take advantage simply because he thinks he's above you? She said with a hint of derision in her voice. Understanding dawns on Naruto as he appreciates how Anko put it into perspective. He nods his understanding as he looks at Yugao and Anko. Well, since we have until tomorrow morning before we can carry out our first sting, let's take the day to relax before we start. What do you say? Naruto says as he looks at his team. They all nod and the decision made. Scene break. A few hours after lunch with his team, Naruto is walking through the town by himself. He had escaped from the kunoichi's grasp when they had entered the only clothing shop within the small town. Despite the fact Naruto wanted to spend time with Kurenai, he had been warned extensively by Jiraiya not to be caught up shopping with women, and when he had seen how even the battle-hardened women acted when the shop entered their sights, Naruto thought it best to get away. Something he did with little actual effort, as he told them he needed to use the restroom and that he would search for some things for himself, thus leaving him free to leave their presence without having them angry at him later. Naruto thought about Kurenai, imagining her trying on different clothes, blushing slightly as he remembered the black dress she had worn on their first date, and then the casual jeans and halter top she had worn when they had relaxed at her house during their second date, all of which hugged her figure so well Naruto was a blushing mess for the first half of their date. Of course, this also brought to mind the jewelry she had been wearing and the fact that he had only ever seen her wearing earrings and a necklace during their first date. Thinking back, he also never saw more jewelry around her house. Not that he had ever been inside her bedroom, a thought which brought an even bigger blush to his face. With this in mind, Naruto began to search in earnest for a jewelry shop, hoping the small town might be so equipped. After searching for close to 20 minutes, Naruto's eyes alighted on the wares of silver and gold on display in the windows of a certain shop. Looking over the impressive and shiny trinkets, he thought about what he would get Kurenai carefully as he stepped into the store, a bell clinking and announcing his presence within the store. Naruto's eyes panned around, looking at the glass cases enclosing an impressive yet small collection of jewelry. Almost as soon as Naruto had stepped inside, a worker had emerged from the back, an elderly woman whom looked much like the older woman who sometimes sat next to the Hokage at important events. Her hair was gray and her skin was wrinkled, yet it was her eyes which brought Naruto to her. They gleamed with an intelligence and wisdom that reminded her of her years. A gleam which reminded him, oddly enough, of the Hokage. The woman sized him up, looking at his slightly disproportionate body with nothing changing in her eyes as she took in his Hittite and obvious armament. It wasn't long before a small frown appeared on her face as she shifted backwards. "What is it you're in need of, Shinobi-san?" she asked. A tone of frosty anger coated her words, and Naruto found himself frowning before he could stop himself. "I want to buy something for my girlfriend," he replied honestly, watching her warily. The woman blinked. Her eyes softened slightly, but she didn't move forward, remaining shifted away from him. "Is that so?" She asked softly, looking directly into his eyes. And you aren't going to try to steal from me? She asked as if it was normal. Naruto shook his head. Never, he said firmly. She stared at him for a few more moments. Tension mounted as Naruto met her gaze evenly, seemingly not bothered by her. It wasn't much longer before she broke into a small and almost relief-filled smile as she looked at him. And what would your young lass wish for? She asked as she moved forward, her eyes and posture now welcome and inviting. Naruto watched her warily as she moved towards the nearest counter to him, looking at her wares. Come now, boy. I can't pick out a present from one to another without understanding you a bit better. She snapped her fingers slightly at him, apparently in an attempt to get his attention, as if he wasn't staring at her already. Naruto blinked, slightly surprised at her actions before his eyes darted down at the jewelry. He immediately saw that there were a myriad of different rings, but he wasn't sure he wanted such a thing for Kurenai. He knew rings were for people who were interested in marriage. He had seen enough marriage proposals when he had been sneaking around to get the general idea, so they were out. He turned his attention to earrings, but he knew nothing about earrings, and he wasn't very comfortable choosing a pair since he didn't really know what type Kurenai would like. Tapping his hand on the glass case, he could see the woman watching him patiently, like she had expected him not to know exactly what he would want when something caught his attention. He looked at the brightly colored bracelet on his arm, a gift from Shikamaru in honor of their friendship. He always wore it since Shikamaru had given it to him after the preliminaries. He smiled as the perfect idea came to his mind. He turned to the woman whom was smiling. I trust you know what you want with that gleam in your eyes? She said, drawing a slightly suspicious look from Naruto. She laughed lightly. I've been doing this many years, boy. Tell me what you're looking for and I'll see what I can do for you. Naruto nodded his head, figuring the woman would be capable of telling people by their body language, something which bothered him that he had shown so much to this woman. I want a bracelet. He began drawing an interested look from the older woman, simple and capable of enduring a ninja's life. He explained. The woman nodded as her eyes turned thoughtful. I also want to engrave her name on it and add a yellow gemstone and a red gemstone to it some way, he said as the woman nodded again. Naruto was quiet for a few moments, mulling over if he had counted on everything he wanted. Anything else? The woman asked. Naruto shook his head after one more moment of deliberation. The woman shuffled away from him, looking through her cases and merchandise. Naruto waited patiently as the woman picked out a few bracelets, putting a few back before shuffling back to him and presenting him with two choices. These are some of my best quality. They will withstand anything but a direct strike from a chakra-enhanced blade. A tone of pride hinted her voice. Naruto wondered what these things must be made of to be that resilient. The first is slightly more expensive, but the detail is more intricate. Naruto nodded, noting how the bracelet of silver gleamed in the light and small flowers were engraved upon the links making up the bracelet. The second is less expensive but a bit more plain, she said, waving her hand at the other bracelet. Naruto looked at the two carefully before asking the price of both. He blinked when the price was much more affordable than he thought they would be. He grinned as he picked out the more expensive one. I can engrave it now and put the gemstones next to the name. Is that acceptable? She asked. Naruto nodded, and after giving her Kurenai's name, the old woman shuffled into the back to complete her transaction. It was a mere half-hour later that the woman emerged, presenting the bracelet in its own case and smiling at Naruto's shining eyes. I hope that this does your last justice. The way your eyes light up about her. She trailed off looking at him with an almost wistful look. She is lucky, she said as she closed the box containing his present, and he handed her the money. Taking the bracelet and thanking the woman, he strode from the store with a smile on his face.